Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and in today's video, we're talking about a traded player exception. This is not something that I ever thought that I would do a video on because I thought it was way too much of a detail-oriented type thing to ever make a video on, but I was talking about it on Twitter yesterday, and people said that I should. So here we are. So the Boston Celtics ended up making the Gordon Hayward signing in Charlotte a sign and trade so that they could get this traded player exception, and we'll get into kind of the details of what that means, but I've obviously been kind of harsh on the Celtics in a recent video about the fact that apparently they decided not to go forward with a sign and trade that would have landed them Miles Turner and Doug McDermott in exchange for Gordon Hayward. And while I would still have that package, they do now have this traded player exception that could be valuable depending on how it's used. And in today's video, I'm going to be explaining what all of this stuff means. But quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing. I upload twice a day, every day, all throughout the NBA offseason, and we are very, very close, less than 4,000 subscribers away now from 100K, which is insane. You can also leave a like rating on this video. It would help me out a ton, lets me know that you're enjoying the content, and gets it out to more people on YouTube. And you can check me out at various socials at the bottom of the screen. But with that said, let's go ahead and talk about what this traded player exception means for Boston. So as I said, there was a scenario that existed where Boston could have gotten Miles Turner and Doug McDermott, and they ended up passing on that sign and trade possibility. Hayward ends up signing in Charlotte, and it benefited both teams to create a sign and trade rather than an outright free agency signing for Hayward to end up in Charlotte. And what this did was this created this is the reported number, $28.5 million traded player exception. Now, we hear about these things sometimes, but they're very rarely used. The most recent and probably most notable time that these have been used is when the Golden State Warriors used it to absorb Kelly Oubre into their salary cap and in their roster a handful of weeks ago. But in some ways, this is a big deal, and in others, it really isn't. So first, let's talk about what exactly this means. So a traded player exception allows a team to take on salary in a trade even though they're over the salary cap, while not sending out matching contracts. So if you have a traded player exception, you can take on that much salary in a trade, even if you're over the salary cap and you're not sending out matching contracts that normally you would have to. Normally, if a team is over the salary cap, they have to send out contracts that match, I believe, 75% of what they're taking in the deal. But that is in a regular trade scenario. But now Boston has this $28.5 million trade exception at its disposal. And this is what it allows Boston to do. They can take on the contract of a player worth up to $28.5 million in a trade and send out whatever salaries they want to, and they can still take on that $28.5 million player or up to that $28.5 million number. So they can combine players with this trade exception. They can send out players that have smaller contracts and get back a player that has a contract worth up to that $28.5 million number, and the trade will still work, and they combine players in the deal. However, they cannot combine contracts with the traded player exception. Here's what I mean. In a scenario in which the Celtics wanted to acquire someone like Andre Drummond via a trade who makes just over the value of this traded player exception. Again, it's worth $28.5 million. Andre Drummond is making 28.7 next season. If they wanted to acquire Andre Drummond, they simply wouldn't be able to unless they sent out matching salaries, okay? So they could send out Smart and a whole bunch of other contracts that actually work in that 28.7 number like you would in a normal trade, but they can't use the traded player exception even if they send out a player like Carson Edwards that would, in combination with the exception, make them match that 28.7 number. That's not how traded player exceptions work. You can't combine the salaries of players with the traded player exception itself. However, you can use it to take on a bigger contract while sending out smaller contracts. For example, they could take on the contract of Harrison Barnes, which is over $22 million, in exchange for basically nothing. Again, we're using the Carson Edwards example here, and that trade would work, and you would use $22 million or whatever of that traded player exception. So there's a perfect example of exactly how this works. The player that you're getting in return, no matter what you're sending out, the player that you're getting in return has to make less than that $28.5 million number for this season. It doesn't matter if you attach extra contracts. It does not combine with player salaries. It is its own thing. But that can still obviously be very helpful. And here are a handful of players that could possibly fit in a trade for this traded player exception. DeMar DeRozan, who makes less than that number, Al Horford, Buddy Hield, Harrison Barnes, who we just mentioned, Miles Turner, and on down the list. Boston could acquire any number of highly paid players using this traded player exception. Now, they can't use it as an asset in a trade. They can't trade it to another team. It is theirs and is theirs only, and it expires a year from yesterday or the day before, whenever the Hayward thing was made official. So I understand that those are some very detailed things, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we're potentially making Celtics trade scenarios up here. Basically, what this means for Boston is it's like having a $28.5 million expiring contract on the roster that you can't combine with other salaries. So like, if Boston wanted to make a move for someone like Miles Turner, someone like Harrison Barnes this season, they salary-wise would have to include someone like either Kemba Walker if they wanted to use that big of a number, or Marcus Smart, because they don't have a ton of those like in-between contracts that they can cobble together. But they can make use of this traded player exception and bring in someone like Miles Turner, Harrison Barnes, or whoever, and add to their roster despite being over the salary cap with the use of the TPE and send out just whatever. Now, the two scenarios in which this would be used are A, if a team like Sacramento or like Oklahoma City just simply wants to dump the contract of a particular player and not get assets in return. That is the most common use of this traded player exception, which was the case for Oklahoma City and Golden State with the Kelly Oubre thing. Obviously, Oklahoma City did get back a future first. It turns out, though, that it's pretty likely that's just going to end up being second-round picks. Oklahoma City wanted to save money. Golden State used the traded player exception. They took on Kelly Oubre's contract, and it was essentially a salary dump, for lack of a better phrase. So that's one scenario in which this can work. Or Boston can use this to acquire a star or a highly paid player that they wouldn't normally be able to acquire without giving up someone like Marcus Smart or Kemba Walker, while then sending out other assets. So for example, if they wanted to acquire someone like Al Horford or someone like Buddy Hield, and the other team wants assets in return, they can trade back any number of players that are on rookie contracts or first round picks or whatever they want to trade, and then absorb that contract into that traded player exception. Those are the two scenarios here, either a salary dump or you have to send back actual assets, but the assets don't match up in contracts, and it doesn't matter because the traded player exception still exists. Now, generally, these things don't ever get used, and they get talked about a good amount if you're really into the salary cap stuff, and it's always kind of lingering like, oh, they have this traded player exception, they could use this, they could use that. And most of the time they don't get used because it requires a relatively specific set of circumstances, and it excludes certain players from being able to be traded to a particular team with the traded player exception. So for example, that 28.5 number is significant because there are a handful of players, most notably Andre Drummond, and if you want to get really crazy, Bradley Beal, that make just over that 28.5 number, which means they are not eligible to be traded in a deal in which the traded player exception would be used. They would have to send out someone like Kemba Walker in a trade in exchange for someone like Bradley Beal to make the salaries work. So a lot of times the TPEs don't get used and they get talked about, but this is the biggest traded player exception in league history. So maybe this one will get used. Again, as I said in the beginning, I personally would rather have Doug McDermott and Miles Turner on the roster rather than this huge trade exception that may or may not be used. We'll see how Boston ends up using it. I think if it is used, it would be in a scenario where they're taking on salaries from a team like Sacramento, whether it be Buddy Hield or Harrison Barnes, or if they give up some assets in exchange for someone like Miles Turner. But again, I just would have rather them traded return in the first place. The other thing that they could do with this, however, is you are able to split this up into multiple players. So if we get closer to time where players are being bought out, Boston could go to a particular team and be like, you know what, you don't have to buy this guy out, just send him to us, we'll take him into the TPE, we'll add him to our roster. That way they don't have to compete with other teams on the buyout market, they can just acquire players. So within that 28.5 number, they can take on multiple players, they can use it multiple times, they can just keep taking pieces off. They can take an $8.5 million a year guy, put him into the traded player exception and still have $20 million left. That is a possibility. And I don't know if they're actually going to use it, and I'm honestly really surprised that there were enough people that were interested in this over on Twitter for me to make a video about it, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys kind of understand where I'm coming from here. I hope I did a good job explaining what exactly a traded player exception is and how it could help Boston with some of their trade endeavors this season or moving forward. Again, they've only got like a year or so to use it. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.